Yesterday I watched a video by Jason Silva because it was sent to my email, and it's called Ourselves as Our Biggest Threat. And he begins by saying that 800,000 people a year commit suicide. And unfortunately, saying commit suicide is old languaging based on back in the day when ending one's life was actually a crime. So it was committing a crime. So that's why it was said that somebody would commit suicide. But now I think the languaging has been upgraded to died by suicide or something like that. Things like that. But at the same time, maybe saying commit suicide gives a greater effect, and that's what people are used to hearing, so whatever. I don't know why he chose to say commit suicide, but I sometimes say it too. I sometimes slip it out. But then I usually correct myself because it's not a crime anymore. And it's kind of strange that it would be a crime, because who are they going to punish? Though it was probably for more like deterrence and insurance policy purposes and things like that. But anyways, I don't know what I'm talking about. But then he also said it's astonishing that that many people a year by active volition would end their life or something like that. And I know from my experience that I've nearly gone through with ending my life a couple of times, but I've never wanted to. It was more feeling like there was something that took me over. And there was this element of me watching my body make a beeline for something to end my life. And it was very scary to actually just watch it happen, not actually do it myself. So I think to say that 800,000 people a year volitionally do it is probably a bit of a misunderstanding, because I think there's almost this program that can take us over sometimes and make us do it while this element that really doesn't want it to happen watches it happen. And I don't know if that's true. We can't really ask people, but I've been in that scenario a few times where it took all my effort to tilt myself in enough of the direction to not do it. And that's why I have the Zap strap that I always keep in my purse, so I know I can. It's almost like a tug of war to get to safety before that element actually does something, and could be some kind of horrific scene of hanging, or that's the one I'm afraid of the most, actually. So it's getting myself to safety and strapping my wrist to something firm instead of ending up hanging myself or something like that. So I don't feel I would ever do it by volition. And whatever volition I have left has always managed to keep me safe from that force of gravity. It's almost like a force. It's not. It's like if you're falling out of a window. If you fall out of a window, you don't have a choice. It's over if it's high enough. So it's kind of like just really stepping back from that ledge when something is pulling you to jump, and it's not wanting to. So who knows how many people experience it that way. It's more like feeling like one is programmed to do it at some point. Yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about, but yeah, I know for me I have lots of plans to not do it, and I don't want to do it, but I also know there's this weird thing that comes in sometimes and it almost pulls me towards doing it, and I fear that. It's not that I want to. So yeah. And he even mentioned a statement, our hunger for meaning. And a lot of what I've talked about with myself is this meaning making process. And again, not saying it has meaning ultimately, but it has meaning subjectively. And I think that by creating meaning with oneself, that meaning is almost the anti-gravity. It's almost the levity that keeps me, or a person maybe, from that vortex of gravity that can pull one down into those lower levels of consciousness that could result in that happening. And the lowest level of consciousness, according to Dr. David Hawkins, is shame. And so when a person is in the level of consciousness of shame, one has a higher likelihood of acting out certain behaviors that could cause one to end one's life. Whereas if we're in consciousness of love and oneness and those higher levels of consciousness on the scale of consciousness, then we are not a threat to our own physicality in the same way. So I feel meaning making is super important, even if it's meaningless to other people. And even if it's meaningless 5 minutes after we make that kind of meaning, I feel it's really the anti-gravity. And I did a few videos in January where I was talking about shame, but I didn't really fully get into it. And I know there will be a time that I want to get into it, but it's just not now, perhaps because of the fragility of really going into that at this moment. So it's in the back of my mind. It's not something I'm fully ignoring, but I still feel like I need to keep myself ahead of this gravity that could cause me to go into shame quite quickly, and maybe one day end my life, and that could happen. So wanting to create as much meaning and dialogue with myself while I still can. And maybe there will be a time when I can't. And maybe making this meaning keeps me ahead of any of those kind of times where I can't. And I do feel that it's important to have the universe on my side, and I feel like I do at the moment, but I also feel like there's a lot of dark forces and things that could easily pull me back into a place where I really feel that the universe isn't on my side, and maybe I don't even belong in the universe anymore. So for now, I'm having fun, and I do also believe, and I don't know if it's a belief, but it could have been a belief before, in sort of having to make up for a lot of bad karma in past lives, in my current life, and it just seems like that's something that I've been a part of, and so wanting to make up for that, wanting to make more value than I seem to have subtracted from my life and from the collective in ways, and I think I'll know when I'm ready to look at that more, and the universe will probably tell me. And he said a quote by Tolstoy that man's inability to live without a way to bridge the finite with the infinite is severely under threat. And what I saw from that quote was, I feel like map consciousness is the bridge between the finite and the infinite. And it's actually a state of walking on that bridge and walking between the worlds and in both worlds at the same time. And it's quite challenging and rich and beautiful. So I feel like we're actually labeling and pathologizing this bridging state. And it could be a really meaningful state, especially if it was framed in a different way and supported in a different way and received in a different way. Because a person walking in both worlds actually needs some support, and it's a vulnerable state because the ego isn't so much intact. So when it's not really intact, it's more suspended. When other egos come in and push one towards something like the psych ward, well, that's what's going to happen, and a person might go kicking and screaming, but they don't really have a choice a lot of the time, and then they get stuck in a paradigm that can be helpful, but it can also be quite detrimental. And it can also prevent finding meaning in that bridging state and making meaning from that bridging state in the future. And I had a little example of this the other day. A friend of mine was showing me a painting that they were working on, and they were saying they're experimenting with some color, and I was looking and I didn't really see any color. I saw something that looked white. And then when they said, this is blue, all of a sudden I could see that it was blue. So by saying something is something, it makes it turn more into that. So if we're in a bridging state and people come along and say, oh, this is a mental illness, then it turns more into that. It accentuates the characteristics and makes one more aware of the characteristics of the state that could be categorized as that. Whereas if somebody was saying, this is some kind of spiritual awakening, and pointed to all the bits of that, then those are the things that would be augmented and made salient and wondered about, and the whole framing of it is a bit more hopeful and interesting instead of completely hopeless. Even though they say, oh, there's hope and recovery and all that, once a person sees that that's what they're being pushed towards, it feels very hopeless. And the concept of hope is introduced because of all that hopelessness. We wouldn't have to think about, oh, there's hope, if we weren't made to feel so hopeless just by being slapped with a label. So it's interesting that this thing that could be a bridge for people is turned into an abyss. And I feel like if that bridge was honored in people that reach that bridging state, that bridge might open up for more people. And when it does open up, they're able to walk that bridge and cross it. But since nobody's able to cross it, we're not able to map out that other territory and bring that map to others, and then provide new hopeful context, and then that allows the process to happen easier. Just the same thing when people thought it was humanly impossible to run a 4-minute mile, and then somebody ran it, and it took a long time for that to happen, and then shortly after, so many other people were able to run it because it made it possible. It made people change their beliefs about that and what was possible. So the same thing could be true if some of us are able to cross that bridge and share it, then it opens up that possibility for others. And the more people that cross, and the more people that live in that way of being able to cross the bridge, the more people that can do it. And he says we don't have a connection with something larger than ourselves. Well, that state of map consciousness, we definitely feel connected to something larger than ourselves. Not just through words and faith and belief, but actual experience and actual living reality. And I wrote down to myself, is it experience or is it actually reality? So oftentimes we have some kind of experience and then we remember it, and then we try to re-experience something similar. So we try to move through reality looking for a similar experience that we're holding in our brain from the past. So we're never actually in contact with reality because we're looking for an experience. And Krishnamurti talks about this thing about experience, and I never quite got it, and I don't know if I get it now, but I'm seeing that if one holds an experience that one had in the past and is trying to make that salient, or is moving in reality but only narrowing it down to a past experience and wanting to repeat that, then we're not actually moving in reality. So I feel like this awakening or this in touchness with map consciousness is actually being in touch with reality, not with reality with a superimposed past experience, hoping to be repeated, hoping to have a repeated sensation by recalling that. So I can kind of see that that state of map consciousness is reality, and we're never actually in touch with this richness of reality because we're holding on to past experiences. So when that reality touches us, because it's not something we can actually reach for, it's there, but we can't be with it because of our past experiences getting in the way. But when it actually gets in touch with us for some reason, it feels so foreign because it's nothing like we've ever experienced before, and it can't be. So I was sort of seeing that, and I remember there was a excerpt by Krishnamurti saying, there is a reality that when come upon the mind transforms it. You don't have to do a thing. So really saying there's nothing we can do to contact that. And interestingly enough, a lot of people who go into map consciousness don't really do anything in particular. It's a mental illness, but it could just be having this other reality or reality get in touch with us, and it really transforms everything. And that transformation process can look foreign, which is then again labeled as some kind of mental illness. And in saying that, and in professionals telling us that, and us believing that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And he says we're starved for deeper meaning and significance, and something about having mystical experiences. Well, there's people out there having mystical experiences, but when they do, they're slapped with a mental illness. So it's demystified by giving it all that kind of terminology. And I wonder if at some point I'll get reacquainted with the mystery. And he gives a quote by Percy Walker in The Moviegoer or something, and talks about to become aware of the possibility of search is to be onto something. And I feel like when we get in touch with map consciousness, we have a sense that we're onto something. But then everyone around us tells us that we're not. We are having some symptoms of mental illness, but I feel that it might resonate with a lot of us to really feel like we were onto something, and maybe moving into those possibilities. And the second part of the quote was not to be onto something is to be in despair. Well, to go with that too, to be onto something and then be told you have a mental illness is really to be in despair. And he says our society, our social structures are organized in a way that is oppressive to way too many of us. And that is so true, and I've talked about that a lot, and how it creates a certain percentage of people guaranteed to come down with a supposed mental illness. But to me, and what I've talked about too, is being in that despair actually turns on this process of the brain starting to create meaning, because if it doesn't, it realizes it could be the end of the organism. Because the organism in despair could end the organism. So some kind of meaning mechanism comes in sometimes in this process of so-called mania or map consciousness, and is sort of a lifesaver in a way. And it sort of could be looked at in how when we go in fight or flight and there's a really dangerous situation, sometimes we can do feats of strength that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. You hear the stories of people lifting a car off of somebody who's trapped under a car or something like that, when they wouldn't be able to do that normally, but since somebody needed that, and since it was a must, that person had the extra strength. And I might have talked about that too, about how, what is it that sees, and to me, perception beyond the ego, the clear perception, sees that situation and is able to calculate the strength the body would need in order to lift the car. Anyways, I feel like this hyper meaning making process could be a similar situation where normally our brain isn't really seeing and making that much meaning. It's sort of lost in the meaninglessness of society, and it's repetitive, so we become habituated to it, and it becomes even more meaningless, even if it had some kind of meaning at some point. So in the same way, the brain kind of goes into this feat of strength of making so much meaning and seeing so much meaning that it's a spark of of energy and of seeing that there is meaning in life, and it can kind of save a life at a certain point. And it can even save the lives of people who have gone into those states and say are diagnosed with bipolar, and they know that at some point they're going to have this amazing, meaningful state, and that could actually save some people from the days when it feels very, very depressing. And I don't know if that's true, but to know that there'll be some days that are just so incredible, it makes the ones that are so awful somewhat bearable. It's sort of like how people can do really crappy jobs if they know they have a really good vacation coming up. So that state of mania where everything feels so amazing can save consciousness from destroying the body in lower states of consciousness. And that's not all of it. It's just maybe a small factor. And to me, there's no reason why we can't all live in those really beautiful states of consciousness all the time, because we are consciousness, and what we experience is based on that level of consciousness. So in high levels of consciousness in mania, we experience a beautiful world. In low levels of consciousness, we experience a pretty crappy world. And then there's the consensus level of reality, which is a level of consciousness, which creates a certain world. And some of us sort of go up and down in states higher or lower than that prevailing level of consciousness. And when we're higher, we seem too happy, and when we're lower, we seem too sad. But really, it's just we're not these consistent egos. We're actually levels of consciousness. We're actually consciousness. So those higher levels of consciousness are trying to get work done through action of the human nervous system in the higher states of consciousness. And also just having a brain go in that state, it changes the whole brain of humanity to have some people seeing in that way. So that's a long-winded thing, and I could probably go on, but I can see how that kind of works. So it's really important to keep one's state of consciousness higher, not what can I do to please my ego and reinforce that. And I'll quote Jason Silva when he says, I think we need to rethink this whole picture of how we organize our lives, come out with better symbolic structures that allow our psyches to merge with some higher meaning. And that quote is exactly what I'm talking about with self-dialogue, is creating other symbolic structures through words and dialogue and talking to oneself. And that context of meaning, even if it's subjective, this context of meaning is particular to this being here, and maybe some of it resonates with other beings. But the trouble is we sort of try to attach ourselves to meanings that are given to us by society, and we don't actually make them ourselves. And so by making this structure of meaning myself, for myself, with myself, by myself, it's creating that structure he's talking about to allow the psyche to connect to more meaning. And we sort of rely on society to do this for us. I really feel like Jason Silva speaks my language. And I've talked about lifestyle design and how do I need to create my life and design my life or organize my life in order to come up with these other symbolic structures, blah, blah, blah. But I feel the way I organize my life moving forward has to be in alignment with the values of map consciousness, which is that state of consciousness where everything felt meaningful and those values are operating. And they're not values that are given by society, but they're values that we can discover within ourselves. And we feel them, but a lot of times what happens is we don't actually act based upon those values because they're the values of our nervous system, but the values we've been given by society come in and superimpose over that. So we might look at somebody and feel like we want to give them a hug, but society comes in, oh, I don't know if I should give them a hug. So every time we do that, it's a shock to the nervous system because it has this natural spontaneity like we had as children that is written over by the rules of society. But when we can question that, we can actually get in touch with the values of our actual neurology, which flux and flow and can change in the moment. The thing of being a human being is we're very adaptable. So can we be that fluid to really adapt to be with the moment and actually be the moment? Can we be the moment and not the me? Because the me is actually the noise superimposing itself over the moment and making us feel like we're missing something and not in touch with the moment. And that's what we're missing, is the moment. And then at the end, he gives the National Suicide Prevention line. And I bet you anything, if you call that, you could get yourself in the system and on meds pretty darn quick. So yeah, it could be valuable, but I would only put that up there if one has actually tried it for oneself and been helped, perhaps. And that's another thing with the self-dialogue. I have trouble connecting with society sometimes. So if I have this strong connection and relationship with myself, then I'm sort of relating with myself in my own world and making that more mirrored in my brain, I guess. And it's true, it affects my reality. If I wasn't doing an hour or 2 or 3 of talking to myself and editing the videos a day, I could be out with people. So I'm definitely neglecting society just by virtue of spending time talking to myself instead. And it's almost like a lot of times I'd rather just talk to myself because some of the other stuff can be difficult. And I don't know if that's right or wrong, it's just sort of what's happening. So I didn't intend to spend a whole video talking mainly about one 3-minute Jason Silva video, but that's what happens when I watch 3 minutes of something, it turns into 30 minutes of something of my own. And that's why I have to be selective. But I watched that video and then I was thinking, oh my gosh, there's a lot there. So that could be key. Is it an experience or is it reality? If it's something we recognize, then it's something based on past experience and it's not reality. And last thing, I feel like meaning making is the cure and not the disease. Yet when we go into this hyper meaning making state and we're making and seeing meanings other than the ones given to us by society, and our perceptions have changed because of that, we are said to have some kind of brain disease, when really I feel like the meaning making is the cure for the dis-ease. We are in dis-ease of society, and so this meaning making process gets activated in the brain to hopefully save humanity in a way, save the individual organism, and if people are able to harvest that and translate it into something people can understand, then maybe other people don't have to go through that meaning-making process in the same way, because it can be very challenging. And the thing is too, if people are able to connect with some of those meanings, then it will make life less meaningless for other people. And then that will eliminate or reduce the need for other people to go through this meaning-making transformation. It'll just be sort of the fabric of society at some point. And that's enough about that video.